Okay, and Robbie, can you see the waiting room? Yep. Okay, let them in. '86, counting down. A few more.
Well, holy moly, everybody. Here we are at the Flying by the Seat of Our Pants Bird Festival. And it's a Zoom festival, of course, because you're here. And we are really looking forward to the next session. The next session is an amazing young lady. Her name is Sarah Killingsworth, and she's going to talk about about advanced bird photography for a couple hours. So I can't wait for all that, but I think we're going to learn a lot of things. Before we get started, let me do a few standard announcements that everybody needs to know. And one of those is we are recording this meeting, so that's important. We will hope to have it on our website or Vimeo or someplace in a couple of days after we get our act together. And so that will be coming. As a Zoom meeting here, there are some normal functions that everybody's used to, but we're not going to use them. For example, you can't talk. We're going to mute you and everybody else, because when you have a couple hundred people talking at the same time, it's just crazy. So the mute function will be on, but we do want to hear from you. And so the way we will do that is through the chat function. So halfway through the program, we will open the chat, and that's really just for questions for Sarah. What would you like to know specifically that she hasn't covered? So let her cover some things first, then write a question in the chat. And when you do that, chat to me directly, Chris Cameron. It says me, Chris Cameron, asked me a question, and I will ask those questions when we get a chance with chat. Also, you know, there's that raise hand function. Don't use it because we're not going to recognize it. We just don't have time to do that. So that's just the way it is right now. When you're doing a fly by the seat of your pants Zoom festival, you have to make some adjustments. Finally, before we introduce our speaker, I just want to let you know, all these presentations are free. And in fact, you can share them with everybody you want. Invite your friends and neighbors. You know, when Sarah's gets a little boring, go on your Instagram account, invite your friends, and then jump right back in. So they're all free, open to everybody. But we are trying to take some donations because our in-person festival got canceled. And so we have tens of thousands of dollars of expenses we're trying to make up so we can have an in-person bird festival next year. So if you're willing and able, we'd love to have a donation. You can do it several ways, you know, write us a check, drop something in the mail, or you can go to our website and click on the link that says donate now that goes through PayPal. Or if you're one of the cool kids who knows how to use a smartphone, on our first and ending slides, we will have those fancy squiggly QR codes that you can make a donation through Vimeo or PayPal. I know Bob, my friend, always jokes, but you know what? Vimeo has a limit of $2.99, and we have people who've wanted to donate more than that. So if you want to donate more, you have to use the PayPal one, not the Vimeo one. So anyway, on to our program. Let's talk about this person who's going to chat with us. Her name is Sarah Killingsworth, and she is a Marin-based California naturalist, wildlife educator, conservation photographer, and filmmaker. She is a program coordinator for Project Coyote's Keeping It Wild Youth Education and Outreach Program. She's a member of the NANPA Ethics Committee. She loves educating students of all ages about local wildlife. She's a frequent public speaker, and she likes to talk specifically about coexistence with wildlife, particularly native predators. In fact, she's got a great article about bobcats, suburban bobcats, really a great one with amazing pictures. Her photography has been published in local and national media, in print and online. She's passionate about photography, especially ethical photography, and hopes that by sharing her wildlife photos, she will inspire others to love and protect wildlife. So Sarah, that's a lot of stuff about you. So we hope you pull it off. Come on, tell us Tell us how we can become better bird photographers. It's all you.
All right, Chris, thank you very much for that generous introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So this is the Flying by the Seat of Our Pants Bird Festival, and anyone who knows me knows that is not my preferred way to roll. So this presentation was designed from the master class that Donald Quintana and I were supposed to do as an all-day class yesterday. So I want to give him credit for some of the content because it's from our shared outline that I created this program. And obviously it's hard to cram into a couple presentations over the course of 2 hours, all the material that we might have covered in a day-long excursion. And we don't have the benefit of shooting photos together. But all that being said, I'm hopeful that I have some things to share that will be helpful for everybody. And I'm really interested in hearing your questions. There's probably a wide range of levels of experience of those of you joining us. So any question is a good question and I will answer them. And so let's get started. So I'm gonna skip through this. Chris already covered all of the background information about me. I am Northern California based, for those of you who are curious, in the San Francisco Bay Area. So the way I designed the talk for today, we have part 1 and then part 2. And part 1 is largely technical pieces of photography and mastering bird photography. And part 2 is more on the artistic and compositional side. But there's obviously going to be some overlap. So we'll jump right in. So the first consideration in photography is looking at light, because light impacts everything about your image. And there are a number of different ways that you can impact how much light is getting into the camera for your image. That includes shutter speed, it includes your aperture or f-stop, and it includes your ISO. There's also a consideration on the angle of light and how that impacts the quality of your image. This is a juvenile peregrine falcon fledgling for those of you who are falcon fans. I love predators, including falcons and raptors. So talking about shutter speed. Shutter speed for a bird in flight is, for me, typically a minimum of 1/1600. And that's for larger or slightly slower birds. And when a bird is flying towards you, you generally need to increase your shutter speed to faster, to 1/2000 or 2500. And for a flying peregrine, like the first image I showed, it's usually even 4000. Hummingbirds you can also do at that speed if you really want to get the wings sharp. But sometimes it's really cool if a hummingbird is hovering over a flower to actually slow your shutter speed down and let the wings blur. So that can be a cool effect. But the thing about increasing your shutter speed to keep up with the bird speed is that the faster your shutter closes, the less light it lets in. And so you're going to have a resulting increase potentially in your ISO or other settings, depending on how much of your camera settings are manual versus you're letting the camera decide for you automatically. This is a male northern harrier who was showing off for a potential mate. He is flying upside down, which just cracked me up. You can see his feet there at the top. So aperture, or your f-stop, is how far open your lens is. And the smaller the number, so 4, 4.5, 5.6, the smaller that number, the wider open it is. The wider open it is, the more light you get in, but it also has a shallower depth of field. So what that means is if you have a bird that's moving quickly or is large, you need a larger depth of field to get all of it in focus and keep it in focus. And so for something like this, this is an adult male peregrine falcon on the ground. He's got a gull kill behind him. I'm going to have at least an f-stop of something like 6.3 or 7.1. And if it's a group of birds or a really large bird, I might even be at 9. The depth of field for the same f-stop, so an f-stop of 6.3, excuse me, that depth of field is going to be shallower the closer to you the object is, or your subject is. And there are apps and calculations that will tell you, based on your exact settings, what your depth of field is. But it's important to know that the closer something is to you, the larger depth of field you're going to need, and therefore that higher f-stop number. So the other thing to think about is ISO, and this is the sensitivity to light or how bright the camera makes the image. A higher ISO, a higher number, generally means that you can have more noise, like a graininess to your image, or potentially blotchy color. So that's just a quick overview of the different components of the settings. Ideally, and I don't know how many people watching are shooting in manual settings, all manual or manual with auto ISO. If you're shooting in auto everything, I would encourage you to at least shoot in shutter priority, allowing you to control your shutter speed. And some people set it for aperture. I know wildlife photographers who use aperture priority. The problem with that is that it may pick a slower shutter speed. And that allows you to pick your depth of field, but to make sure there's enough light, it may slow down your shutter speed, at which point you might end up with a blurry image if the animal is moving or the bird is moving towards you. So auto ISO, I generally do use unless it's really low light. So on foggy days or pre-dawn or after dusk, I will not let my camera, I usually don't like my ISO to go above 3200. Sometimes in super low light settings, I will let it get to 6400 or even 8,000 or 10,000. But my preference is to keep it below that. So if on its own, it's going above 2000, then I'm checking it. And let's see. And this is also a male Northern Harrier, the gray ghost. So in addition to those settings that I just talked about, the other thing you can do in your camera is an exposure adjustment. And exposure adjustments allow you to tell the camera to make something brighter or darker than it would set based on its reading of the light in the situation. And this is really important when there's a big contrast between your subject, your photo subject, and the background. So if you have a dark thing, a dark subject against a light background, so that's typically a bird against either a blue sky or clouds, or something, a bird or other animal, something against the snow, you want to use a positive exposure adjustment. So, and it's intervals of thirds. So a plus 0.3, plus 0.7, plus 1. And when I am shooting, so this is a red-tailed hawk with a long-tailed weasel actually in its talons. I probably had this overexposed by 1.3, given how dark a bird it is, and the shadows under it, and how bright the sky is. The opposite is true when you have a light subject and a dark background. So think of that as like an owl in a really dark tree, or a shorebird, a light colored shorebird against some dark mud. And for that, you want to generally take your exposure adjustment and dial it down. So you're going into the negative numbers. And that's because the camera, in reading the background, would otherwise make your light subject much too bright because it's reading the dark background. And so you would actually blow out, meaning that the whites, the light parts of your image, you lose all the data because it's gone so far in its exposure. It's just overexposed and you can't get it back, basically. So one of the things that we were going to talk about in the masterclass yesterday was just things to think about when you prepare and go and shoot. And just some things to think about. And again, I don't know the level of experience of everyone on this. So these may all be things you know, some of them you know, none of them. But just trying to share tips, things that Donald and I both thought were useful for preparing to go out and shoot. So one thing that's really useful is to check your gear and settings on the camera and make sure that everything's ready ahead of time. So ideally, like even the night before or the morning of, make sure that you have changed any settings that you might have adjusted for your last photo shoot and go back to your baseline. So you could have an exposure adjustment, you could have your shutter speed or ISO, adjusted from where you would normally have it based on shooting into the evening, for example. And both Donald and I have done that. You're shooting late into the evening, you're shooting owls, you've got a slow shutter speed, you've probably got your manual ISO, it's a high number. And so you're trying to let in as much light as possible. And if you get up the next morning and you do what I do, go shoot a bobcat in the field, you've blown it out because you've put in so much extra light that you don't need in a daylight setting in a bright field. So it's, and if you look at the back of your camera, you'll notice, but if you have only a few seconds to photograph something, you may not be able to recreate the image that you thought you were getting and be really disappointed. So it's really a good idea to set your camera back to a normal baseline every night or every, when you come back and you upload your cards or unpack the gear, to reset the camera so that you have it ready to go the next day. In case people are curious, my sort of usual settings, it does depend a little bit on what lens I have attached to the body, but typically the shutter speed is going to be 1/1600, an f-stop of 4.5 or 5.6, auto ISO, and I usually have an exposure adjustment of 0.3, so a positive exposure adjustment, and that's in part based on shooting with the Nikon that I shoot with. It does vary by camera how much exposure adjustment, if any, and what you're shooting. Another thing to think about in terms of post-processing your images is the format that your photos are being recorded in. So your camera has options, and you can record things as JPEGs or in a RAW format. And if you shoot in RAW, which I do, that maximizes the data that the camera is storing from that image, and it gives you the most flexibility in post-processing to correct for shadows, to bring down highlights, and to recover basically as much data as available in the image. You have a lot less flexibility if you're shooting as a JPEG. There's just less you can do in post-processing. So RAW format files are larger, so you will fill your memory cards faster and take more space on your hard drive, but it's worth it in terms of what you can do with the images afterwards. It's always good to have extra batteries and memory cards. And when you're planning, when you're going out, it's a good idea to think about the best time of day to shoot in that particular location. That includes the angle of light, and some places are shaded by a hillside in either the morning or the afternoon. Some places get really harsh light in the middle of the day based on glare off the water or moisture in the air. And if you're going to shoot shorebirds, then looking at the tide schedule and getting a sense of when you're going to maximize your ability to get birds on the shore is also a good idea. I have to talk a little bit about ethics because it's really important to me that wildlife photographers are ethical in their approach to their subjects. So being ethical really is about having empathy for the wildlife that you're photographing. And we are all a disruption. Every time we go out into the field, as a human being, we are disrupting that ecosystem. And the goal is to do it as little as possible, to be a minimal disruption. And even with the best of intentions, everyone makes mistakes, but ideally we go out there with the intention of disturbing the subject as little as possible. I really encourage people to spend time observing wildlife before you take any photos. So getting a sense of animal or a bird's comfort level, of their behavior, of their patterns, can be really, really helpful. So that time that you spend observing can improve the quality of the photos you get, because you'll know more about what might happen next, and you'll be able to anticipate where you want to position yourself, how you want to position your camera, and get the best shots. It's also really helpful to use your car as a blind. If you're someplace where you can drive and take photographs, birds that are near roadways that are accustomed to cars going by are often far less skittish with a car slowing down than a person getting out of a car and walking towards them. The exception that I've found is kestrels. Kestrels are skittish if you slow your car down. They don't mind if you drive by, but it's amazing to me that they can sense right as you're braking and about to get to a stop where you could take a picture, they'll fly off. At least the ones up here do. So knowing how tolerant a particular species is also important, because you don't want to risk the health of the bird. So for example, this is a picture of a barn owl. It was hunting. It was a really foggy morning, and so it was surprisingly hunting during daylight hours. But barn owls generally are difficult to photograph because they're skittish and easily flushed. And if they're flushed, they can be taken by predators. In fact, I once saw photographers accidentally flush a barn owl, and a great horned owl swooped out of the tree, scooped it out of the sky, and took it back to the tree and ate it. So it really does create a risk for vulnerable species to flush them. So trying to just be really mindful of that, and also just mindful of signs of stress. So different species have different ways of showing us that they're uncomfortable with our presence. So I mentioned studying behavior, and it really does help to get a memorable shot if you know the kinds of behavior that the bird that you're photographing might engage in. It also, as I said, improves your ability to assess how much impact you're having on the bird, whether you're stressing it out, and if you are stressing it, that you need to back away or potentially even leave altogether. So if you can spend an hour reading up on the species, or my preference is actually always just to get out and watch, even from a further distance than I might photograph, but just to learn and see what the behavior patterns are, you can get some really good insights that way. And this image is, so it's the male peregrine falcon. He's just brought a kill back to, these are 3 fledglings. And if you photograph falcons, you know that as the fledglings are learning to fly and hunt on their own, the parents continue to bring food back, and they do these midair exchanges of the food. So they'll bring the food back, and if you have multiple fledglings, in this case there are 3, they're all competing to get that bird. And you can see down here the prey. So if you know that this is going to unfold, when you see one of the parents flying back with prey in its talons, you know the next thing that's going to happen is the fledglings, the ones that can fly, are going to zoom up and try and get it. And so you need to have your shutter speed up, and you need to have your depth of field large enough to cover a number of birds moving quickly through the air and try and get all of them in the frame. Which is, falcons are such a test of reflexes. It's really hard to do, but I do love watching them. So other things that you learn when you're watching a species are the signs of stress, as I mentioned. Owls tend to have signs like their eyes get bigger, they kind of widen them. Sometimes they'll puff up, and some species will refuse to return to their nest if they are concerned that there are people too close to it. So being near a nest is a particularly sensitive situation, and it's best to not spend much time near a nest because it may prevent the parents from coming back and feeding the young. And the last thing you want to do is compromise the well-being of the young in the nest. Similarly, if you're standing too close to a bird that's hunting, it may abandon the hunt, and you don't want it to give up the chance for that meal. Every time they fly away from us, if we flush them, they're using valuable energy that they have to then replace with eating something. So trying to minimize the disruption to their daily routine. So this is another falcon shot. This is the 2 adults. So when the female is on the nest with either eggs or young chicks, the male will come and bring her a meal. So this is the male bringing a prey back to the female. And again, if you know that that's what's happening or going to happen, and you're watching the nest area, when you see the male coming in with prey, again, you can get ready, change your shutter speed and your depth of field to make it possible to capture both birds in focus, usually moving at high speed. But you don't have to go far to photograph birds and get really beautiful images. So you can scan for wildlife or sit in the same spot on a daily or weekly basis. And that really helps you to have an understanding of what that baseline behavior is in the environment and the birds and animals that live in it. Some of you may have read What the Robin Knows, which is one of my favorite books. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It's a great read, not just about how to sit, but how to learn from what you observe and what it can tell you about what's happening in a space that you're sitting and watching. You can recognize different bird calls as alarms and what they mean in terms of predators approaching. For me, most of what I typically photograph is actually bobcats and foxes and coyotes. And so I know, for example, that scrub jays, if they're calling, is often a sign that there's a bobcat or a fox in the vicinity. And so knowing what happens in an environment can also help you get ready to take a photo. But hummingbirds in your backyard can be a great photo subject. So going back to preparing for a shoot, there's a couple things to note. There are some birds that return to the same perch after hunting. So in my experience, that's often phoebes, it's often owls. And territorial birds like hummingbirds typically have a favorite spot that they'll defend the territory from. And so again, if you sit and watch, you might see that every time the hummingbird zips around, it eventually goes back and lands on the top of the same bush. And that helps you if you want to get a photo of it taking off or coming in for a landing, or you want to get a portrait, you know, that's the spot that you then have to think about the light and the angle of the light in taking the image. And then there are certain behaviors like emptying the tank, so to speak, and pooping before they take off, and also taking off and landing into the wind that are generally true across species. So I'm not going to say every single time, every single bird, but very common. And so if you have a perched bird that empties the tank, it doesn't guarantee a takeoff, but it often is the thing that immediately proceeds a takeoff. So it's a good idea at that moment, if you've been, again, with a low shutter speed because you've got a stationary bird sitting on a perch, crank up the shutter speed and crank up your f-stop to get a little bit bigger depth of field so that when the bird takes off quickly and moves out of the focus area that you've been working on, you get a chance at getting it in focus as it takes off. It allows you to prepare for flight. And if you know that birds generally take off and land into the wind, it means that you would go and hope to have the wind at your back while you're facing the birds to maximize your chance of images of birds coming towards you, either coming in for a landing towards you or taking off towards you. So that's helpful in terms of setting up where you're going to position yourself. This is a great gray owl. It's on a perch, and after it hunted, returned to the same perch. So again, just good to know what species are more likely to do that, not necessarily guaranteed, but more likely. And then you can have your settings ready for that. Another component of images is the story. Is there a story behind the image, and is it necessary to have one? So things to think about when you're composing, and we'll get into this a little bit more in the next piece of this presentation, but what are you hoping to achieve with your image? And at a minimum, it would be evoking an emotional response from the viewer, and we'll talk about ways to do that. So this is a great blue heron with a gopher. Many people don't know that great blue herons eat gophers, not just fish and small amphibians and such things, but there are a lot of things about this story. So there's an emotion, there's a hunt, there's prey, obviously. There's the surprise factor potentially of a great blue heron with a gopher in its mouth. And then there's a further story about rodenticides and the fact that if you're poisoning that gopher, you're also poisoning great blue herons. And that can be part of a larger story about an ecosystem. Can also be part of a story about the number of different animals that eat gophers as their prey and what an important foundational food source they are. In terms of sharp images, one thing that's super frustrating, at least for me, because I'm a stickler for sharp, is images that you take that you think are going to be great, and then they're not tack sharp. And so I'm just going to highlight a couple of reasons that could be why. And then separately, camera or lens issues would be another reason to potentially have it checked out or sent into the manufacturer for a tune-up and repair. But some common reasons are the shutter speed was too slow. And when I started out photographing peregrines, this was definitely a problem I had. I did not realize how fast I had to have my shutter speed to get a zooming peregrine falcon, not even on a dive, just flying by. I had to up the shutter speed to really get it tack sharp. Another issue can be that if you're hand holding, that you're not holding your camera and lens steady. And so learning, there are different stances, learning how to hold so that you can brace your camera against your body using a monopod or a tripod. And if you do that, that cue that a bird is about to take off is a good time to detach your camera from the tripod or the monopod so you can be hand holding it as the bird takes off and flies. And then the other thing that can be a problem is that the focal point for the autofocus was on something other than your subject. And you want the focal point obviously to be your subject. And generally the thing in the image that needs to be the sharpest is the eye of the subject. And so if your focal point is on something other than the eye of the subject, you may end up with an unsatisfying image. And autofocus, depending on what your settings are, can create that problem by being set to something that's the background by accident. And so 2 ways to try and prevent that from happening are to use a single focus point. And every manufacturer has a different name for the different focus points, but you can set it so that you have one focal point that you can move around within the image. And if you use that, you're more likely to have the camera focus on the thing you want it to be focused on, as opposed to some of the group or dynamic focal point choices, which are a grid. And then basically the camera picks from those different points in the grid, which might work out, but it also might not. And the other thing is back button focus. And again, this is where if we were in person, we would be looking at my camera and looking at other people's cameras and setting it up if you don't have it already. But back button focus is a way to separate focusing your camera from the shutter. And so you can push that button, focus it, and then if you move the camera slightly, either intentionally to slightly recompose the image or just by accident, you just aren't standing exactly the way you were. When you push the shutter, the camera is not refocusing on that focal point, because if you've moved, there's a chance that that little movement now has that focal point on the tree behind your subject as opposed to the subject. And so I really encourage everyone to use single focus points and back button focus. And now we are ready for questions. So I think Chris was going to take questions.
Yes, thank you, Sarah. We have opened the chat function, and so people can now begin chatting. And as they begin chatting, we're going to stall for a couple of minutes to let them gather their thoughts and throw a question my direction. A couple things I wanted to plug or ask you a question. I know
Sure.
that Don Quintana leads birding trips. For example, if you wanted to get a picture of a muskox, I think he leads trips to Alaska. Do you lead trips as well or teach courses?
I don't do a lot of that. I have a close friend who runs a safari company up here in Point Reyes, and I do sometimes guide through that company, Point Reyes Safaris. But otherwise, I do educational programs. I've done some one-on-one instruction tutorials for people. So.
And your contact information is in your slides, and anybody can always ask us, and we can and we can get them to you. By the way, I'm not seeing any questions right now. Let's see if I've got. Okay, we're starting to get some questions. But I'm going to just, again, stall for a little bit of time so we get a few more. A lot of bird watchers and bird photographers are starving people, and so they could use your business. I know, like Ray Von Buskirk, one of our keynote speakers, was going to be coming and getting paid, but we couldn't bring him over. So if you want to go to New Mexico or go on a tour with Ray or go on a tour with Don or some of the other folks, that would be really helpful for them, since we had to cancel this event. Also, there are people I was just in Colombia. There are some great photographers down there. And if you'd like connections on Colombia trips, lots of beautiful birds down there. I've got contacts with people who will lead you on a trip down there. The last thing is, a lot of the people that I've been bumping into lately have taken the UC California Naturalist course, and that's a good place to make a lot of new friends. Okay, so we've got some questions here. Let's see what we've got here. What kind of telephoto lens do you use? Let's just start with the basics.
Okay, that is a good question. So I shoot, depends on what I'm photographing, but generally with either a 500 millimeter or 600 millimeter.
Okay, and you answer, I think this was essentially your whole talk, but what shutter speed do you use for different situations? Do you use the tracking feature for focusing?
So I don't use the tracking feature for focusing, potentially because I'm a bit of a control freak, but possibly because they have varying degrees of success. Now, again, I'm shooting on Nikon. I'm not mirrorless yet. I know people who are using the R5 are really, really super happy with the eye focus tracking of that camera. So some of it does depend on your gear, but I prefer to try and track things myself.
On that same note, do you recommend manual focus rather than autofocus?
You know, it can be very hard to get it just right. So it depends on the circumstance. And if it's lower light or if your autofocus is struggling, sometimes manually, like going off of what you were focusing on and then coming back and manually focusing it and then pushing autofocus again will improve it. But I typically, my autofocus is pretty good. And if I've got it on a single point, so I can control where it's focusing, and I've separated the focus from the shutter with back button focus, I don't have a lot of issues with my autofocus not being in focus. There are ways to calibrate your autofocus to make sure it's working properly also.
You mentioned your standard baseline, but I don't think you told us what it is. What is your standard baseline?
My standard baseline is a shutter speed of 1/1600, excuse me, and an f-stop, depending on the lens, of 4.5 or 5.6, which is pretty wide open. And I generally shoot in auto ISO, and I have an exposure adjustment of a positive 0.3.
Some people think auto ISO oversaturates many times. What do you think about that?
I haven't had that problem, but again, it depends on your camera. It depends on the brand of the camera and the camera body you're using. So, I mean, I think if you're capable of manually setting everything, including your ISO, that's obviously ideal. It depends. For me, it's not that often that I'm shooting something that's a stationary object. And so if you're in manual ISO and what you're photographing moves from the shade to the sun, you've got to be dialing all those different things up very quickly to keep up with the subject and have an image that you're going to be happy with. And so for me, auto ISO has worked pretty well. But yeah, if people are comfortable making that adjustment as well as the others and keeping up with the subject, or you have a stationary, you know, if I have something that's sitting still, you know, an owl perched in a tree, then I might play with the ISO too. But for me, a lot of the time things are on the move. It's too hard to change all the things at once and get it all right and still have the animal or the bird in view.
You mentioned the back button. I know what that is on a computer, but several people would like to know a little bit more about the back button focus and how it's used. Does one use it instead of using the autofocus on the shutter? Is it faster, more accurate?
Okay, you're going to have to forgive me. I'm going to step away from my screen and go get a camera. I'll be right back.
Okay, great. And are you guys enjoying this so far? This is my camera. If it's not on this, I don't know. I'm reading these questions because I don't know what any of these words mean, but I'm glad Sarah's here. Okay, what in the world is this back button situation?
Okay, so the back of the camera, this is an icon, has something that says AF on right there. It's a button. And you can go into the menu. So this is a D850. You can go into the camera menu. And like I said, if we were in person, I would help people set this up, but sadly it's a little hard to do over Zoom. But if you go into the autofocus menu, there is a place where your choice is to have the shutter be on or off for the autofocus. And you want it actually to be off. Because basically What happens, the way most cameras are set up, the default is when you push the shutter, the camera does two things. It focuses the autofocus and it closes the shutter and takes the image. What you want to do is separate those two actions. So you use a different button, you program a different button to be the focus button so that you can choose when you're refocusing on something versus when you're depressing the shutter and actually taking the image. So it's the same thing is happening in your camera. You're just separating two functions that are combined into one button as a default and making it possible to focus without depressing the shutter and possible to push your shutter without the camera refocusing. But you are still using autofocus and you're still, for me, it's, there's two different types of autofocus. I'm always in continuous mode, single spot, like single square autofocus.
Okay, Carol shoots a Canon SX70 bridge camera and she is an Apple user. If you shoot in the RAW, do you have a special editing program?
Yeah, so post-processing and editing is definitely that's like a whole other webinar, but I do use Lightroom. I use Lightroom Classic to edit all my images.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry, Chris, can I say one more thing?
Yes, jump in.
So the other thing about post-processing, some people use Photoshop for some elements of image processing. I don't at all, but people do. And the other thing is Topaz has come out with a variety of products that can do some pretty remarkable things to images that would previously have frankly just been garbage because they're slightly out of focus or they're super grainy because the ISO was so high. So Topaz denoise is something that people use, and they've got a couple other products that can help if you have a little bit of camera shake and you want to try and make an image sharper. They have software that will do that as well.
Good. Marco asked that question about Topaz AI, or are there any other similar programs to improve sharpness?
I use the Topaz products. And again, I actually don't use them very often. I'm a bit of a perfectionist in the field, but every now and then I have an image that I really love that I wish had come out slightly crisper or slightly less noisy, and I'll run it through one of the Topaz programs. They do a great job.
In post-processing, do you use the post-processing to decrease the negative effects of a high ISO?
So the negative effects of a high ISO tend to be graininess or blotchy color. The way, so if you're in Lightroom, the way that you adjust for the graininess is, there's a couple different sliders, but basically you can slide something, basically it's smoothness is what you're doing. It's also called luminance in one of the places in Lightroom, but you're using the slider and it's almost like taking like a brush and like smoothing something over. So it starts to look a little bit more like a porcelain doll almost. You lose a little bit of the detail and you lose a little bit of the texture. So it depends what about the image is grainy, whether that really works in Lightroom. I've had images where the graininess was really in the background and it was a pretty dark background. And so you could, there's ways to apply brushes and do noise reduction only on the parts of the image that you've basically brushed over. And so you can, if you don't care about the detail or the texture of what's grainy, then you can kind of wipe it down a long ways. But if your subject is grainy, you're going to get to a point where it starts to look a little bit fake is really the only way I can describe it.
Okay, we have a few people asking intermediate or beginner questions, and I'm going to pass on those questions since this is an advanced bird photography thing. I just want to plug, there's a nature photography group on the Central Coast, co-led by Don Quintana. It's a great way to meet people, find out where the birds are, and get some photo advice. So if you're a beginner and intermediate, check out the meetup website for the nature photography in the area. Hey, could you drop your slideshow? Could you unshare? And
Stop
then,
sharing?
Yeah, stop sharing.
I
And then it's just me and you for a chit chat.
Okay.
It just feels a little more personal, you know? some people are saying they really enjoy the presentation and are thankful for it. So thanks for that little plug. I have had good luck with manual ISO and aperture priority with autofocus, with sweet spot often at f5.6 and ISO 200 and reasonably good light to blur the background and focus for the bird. Any comments?
No, I mean, as long as you've got enough light that it doesn't slow your shutter speed down, that's great. I mean, those are great settings. It's just if you're in a low light situation and you have a moving subject, the camera is going to slow your shutter speed down to let the light in, and you might end up with something that's out of focus or blurred. But otherwise, now if you've got enough light for it, it's great.
I think your next session will get into this question a little bit more, a little bit deeper. But someone wants to know, excuse me, do you ever make images with slow motion of birds as an artistic expression? And I think you might address that next one, but maybe give us a little hint.
Yes.
Thank you. That was a good little hint. Somebody says they use a Canon. In general, do you think the top of the line $12,000 600 millimeter lens will be sharper than a $1,000 Sigma, or is it hype?
I will say that I think it generally will be sharper. You know, everything is dependent on circumstances, and a lot of these lenses are crazy expensive. I was lucky to get mine used from another photographer, so not at full retail. But there is an amazing sharpness. And in general, I will say, because I didn't talk about this earlier, my experience is that lenses that are a zoom lens, so something that's like a 150 to 600, will not be as sharp as a fixed focal length. Whether your fixed focal length is 300, 500, 600. One of the things about Nikon is that they have the Nikkor PF, the fixed 300 and the fixed 500, which are far less expensive than the crazy expensive fixed 400 and fixed 600. The fixed 500 5.6 is a great lens, and was my primary shooting lens for a number of years. And it's, I don't know exactly, I think it's in the ballpark of 3,500. So, I mean, not cheap, but also not 12 grand. And you can get them used. And I think as more and more people go to mirrorless, some of this stuff might even get a little less expensive. There are some great outlets for buying used gear. There's a couple of websites that specifically do that. B&H Photo on the East Coast has a used inventory. So you can, and we'll accept returns. So you can always send it back if you get it and you don't like it, or you think it's more, I mean, usually it wouldn't be damaged, but if there's something about it that you don't like, you can send it back.
Hey, what Nikon body do you use?
So I have the D850 and the D500.
Okay, and what does Don use? Don Quintana.
He shoots on a Canon, and I couldn't tell you which body actually.
Okay, so that was going to be one of the interesting things, to have a Canon and a Nikon person on advanced photography. Hey, maybe next year we could do it again.
I hope so. I would love to do it for real. Yeah, I'm sorry for all the Canon users out there. I am sorry. I have very limited experience with Canon gear, so I'm not able to give the same level of detail on that.
Can you give a quick note about using larger lenses for distance shooting?
So I'm not sure if that's the aesthetic or the ethics of it. There's both. Do you have any more context for the question?
That's it. That's the whole question.
Okay. So, I mean, the reason I shoot with a long lens is because I like getting photos that appear close to the wildlife without actually being in their face and disturbing their behavior and activity. So it's preferable to have a long lens from that standpoint. In terms of the image, the thing that's a little bit tricky, it can be a good thing, is that the longer the focal length of your lens, the more compressed the image appears. So from front to back. So if you were shooting it with a 35 millimeter, you would have greater range, the perception of depth of the different things. If you had a bush, a tree, a cliff, and clouds in the sky, they would feel further apart shooting them with a wider angle lens. And so when you shoot with a 500 or a 600 millimeter, you end up with some compression of the components of what you're shooting, which can be a good thing, but aesthetically isn't what everybody wants. It's hard. I mean, I do have a 70 to 200 lens, an f2.8 70 to 200, which is a great lens, and I love it. And if you can get to a reasonable distance, you can put it, you can get really good images. It's just, you can't quite, you're not going to get as close in. And one of the things we'll talk about in the next piece of this presentation is composition and environmental shots. And environmental shots are shots where the bird or the animal is a component, but the environment which it's in is as much a part of the image and the story as the animal itself. So I do tend to shoot a lot of portraits. Not all wildlife photographers do. There's a variety of different ways to shoot wildlife and birds, but having a wider angle lens gives you more separation between the components of your image, and obviously is much better for an environmental shot.
Good. A couple more questions and we're going to take a little break. This is my camera right here, and wondering what you think about shooting through spotting scopes. Have you ever shot through a spotting scope? What do you think?
I have had photos taken with my phone through a scope in Yellowstone. You know, I think they're fine. I don't think they end up.
It doesn't sound fine. It doesn't sound fine. The way you said that doesn't sound fine at all. But I guess this is an advanced birding class, right? An advanced.
Right. I mean, it's like, you know, if you want, so for example, if you have wolves that are 1.5 miles out and you want a photo of the wolves you saw, you need a camera on a scope. I mean, your phone on the scope, and to take the picture. And it's great. And it's great for the memory. From an artistic standpoint and a composition of a photo standpoint, probably not as desirable.
Okay, last question, and then let me see. There might be a couple questions. There's a couple questions on tripods. How often do you shoot with a tripod, or how about a monopod? What do you think about sling style harnesses? What about tripods with gimbal heads? So talk to us about tripods, monopods, and gimbal heads.
Okay. So tripods, I don't use much. I use them if I'm in a really low light situation, and I use them. I also do filming. And so when I'm rolling video, I'm always generally on a tripod. So my tripod gets more use from filming than from photos. But if you're on a tripod for photos, then you absolutely want a gimbal head. They take a little getting used to, but they are an amazingly flexible and really stable head on a tripod. So I definitely recommend the gimbal heads. The monopod, some of it just depends on your ability to hand hold your camera. If you can hold it steady without, I prefer to be unencumbered without having anything attached to the camera or the lens. But, you know, especially with the bigger lenses, depending on, you know, your shoulders and your back and your, you know, health and strength overall, it may or may not be feasible to handhold. And so monopods are more flexible in terms of just being easier to carry around, but I don't ever use my monopod.
Okay.
Was there another part of the, harnesses or
slings, yeah.
You know, it's funny, I actually don't have one. I keep debating whether I will get one. But I usually hand carry the big lens, and then if I have another body or another lens, it's usually in a backpack. So no sling for me yet. Okay.
Someone mentioned that Don is shooting with a Canon R5.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. He's gone, that he mentioned, I forgot. He was up here recently, and we briefly were touching on that. He's part of the many people who are thrilled with the R5. If you're a Canon shooter, that's apparently on your most wanted list. They're pretty incredible cameras.
Someone else chose the Canon 7D Mark II or III. over the more expensive Pro camera because it works well with things that move like birds and monkeys by taking up to 10 consecutive shots quickly. The disadvantage is it's not a full frame, so they must consider the crop factor when they are shooting. Any comments on that?
Yeah, so it's the same issue that I have with Nikon between the D500 and the D850. The D500 is a crop sensor, so you're getting you're magnifying your image, basically your lens, by 1.5 times. So if you put a 300 fixed focal length lens on a crop sensor, it's the equivalent of a 450 lens. So you get closer, and you do often, you're able to capture faster focus, faster saving of the images. The file sizes tend to be smaller, and it's a little bit different quality than the full frame, but the full frame is a little bit slower. And obviously you don't get that additional +5 or +50% increase in the focal length. So it's a trade-off. And so truthfully, I use both.
Okay. Do you really handhold your camera with a 600mm lens?
I do.
Okay, and we can see from your original portrait shot, you in the field, all tucked in a yoga position that's like rock solid to snap those pictures. Okay, so here's what we're going to do, Bob. I don't know if you're listening, but here's what we're going to do. We're going to take just a couple minutes break. We've got 165 people in the room. We're going to throw up a blank slide for like 3 or 4 minutes. So we can all go to the bathroom and get a drink. And then we are going to come back with Sarah for the second part, which I think is going to be the interesting part, because I don't know what you were talking about that whole first part.
Sorry, Chris. And Chris, Chris, I don't mind, while people look at this slide, if you want to throw me some of those beginner questions and have me answer them while we're waiting, I don't mind doing that if people want to hear.
I'm sorry, I'm going to go to the bathroom so you don't get any beginner questions.
Okay, no beginner questions.
And so we're going to be back real soon, but we want the other people who may have just decided they're going to take part 2 to come in right at the top of the hour. And so we're going to give everybody a chance to go get a drink, go to the bathroom, and come back in just a couple minutes. And you know, if you're not doing anything and you're sitting around there with your camera, see how those QR codes work for the donation. You know, just try it. Put in $1 or $2. All right, we'll see you in just a minute. Hey, everybody, if you're just joining us, we're glad to have you here. We're going to start up in just a couple of minutes. Last night I was eating peanut butter and celery, and my wife said, "You look like a caveman," which reminds me, some normal Zoom protocols is if you're going to go eat your lunch, and if you're not sharing with everybody, please turn off your screen so we don't have to want the pizza slice that you're eating, okay? So turn off your screen. We will be muting everybody, and so you won't be able to jump in and chit chat with us. And we will be opening the chat room so you can ask questions of Sarah towards the end of the program. So we are about to start session 2. I really enjoyed session 1, although I didn't really know much about what she was talking about because I'm not an advanced photographer, but I think I'm really going to enjoy this second half, which is a little bit more on the story and some creative and artistic aspects of photography. So that's going to be pretty cool. Again, you'll all be muted, and don't use a raise hand function because we're not going to recognize it. The chat function will be open towards the end of the program, so you can ask Sarah some questions. Feel free to type your questions in the chat, and then when they're open, we'll ask her the questions. Again, finally, before we get started, the Morro Bay Bird Festival is taking donations in the old-fashioned way. Write a check and drop it in the mail, or go to the website and click the link and make a donation. Or you can see right there on your screen, we've got the little squiggly QR codes. You can put your camera, your not your 600 millimeter lens, but maybe your iPhone camera would make a direct donation to the Morro Bay Bird Festival account through those little QR codes. Now we're getting on to our program. Again, Sarah is an experienced photographer, California naturalist. She's Marin County based. She's a wildlife educator and a program coordinator for Project Coyote's Keeping It Wild Youth Education. Member of the NANPA Ethics Committee, loves educating people about wildlife, specifically wildlife in suburban settings and as people are connected. So Sarah, take it away. It's all yours. Well, I think I'm really going to enjoy this section.
All right, well, I certainly hope you do. Thanks to everybody who's still on and for those who are joining for the second piece. So as I said at the outset, this is a condensed version of the content that Don Quintana and I were going to do as an all-day long masterclass yesterday. So it's pretty jam-packed, and we'll take questions at the end. I've tried to just give an overview of the content. The second half of it is going to focus more on composition and some of the artistic pieces, whereas the first part was more on the technical aspect. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again, and we will get going. Okay, so part 2. There's our falcon again. You can tell I like falcons. So when you are composing a photograph, there are a variety of things that you would consider and make decisions about. The first is your subject. That's obvious. But what is it that you're interested in capturing? Where is it located? And where is it in relation to the light source? So if you go out on a hike or a walk on the beach and you're looking around and you're deciding, oh, there's a flock of elegant terns on the beach and I'd like to photograph them, then the next consideration would be, where is the light source and where do you want to position yourself and your camera to get the best image of those terns? Generally, you want to position yourself between the sun and your subject so that your shadow is like, if you were a sundial, your shadow is pointing towards what you're photographing. It is really helpful to have the full, what's facing you basically be fully in the light. But there's also time of day considerations, and we'll get into that a little bit. The other thing about where you're located is your elevation. So the elevation of your subject makes a difference. If it's something that's on the ground, again, people who know me know, I will be lying in the sand or the mud or the dirt, photographing the thing that's on the ground because I really want to be eye level. If you're taking pictures of a bird that's flying or perched in a tree, then standing is going to work just fine. But if you've got something that's on a low perch, you might want to have it on your tripod or hand hold it, so that you're at the same eye level as it is. And if it's something on the ground, I really encourage you, if you can physically, if you can get down on the ground, either lie down or sit down, kneel, but get as close to eye level as you can. So these next two photos are just to illustrate what happens with the angle of the light. So this is a red-tailed hawk. It was on a post. I took this picture from my car. You can see, looking at this image, that the light is coming from the right-hand side of the photograph. And so the left side of the bird in this image is in the shadow. And that's okay, but you just need to know that that's how a picture will turn out if you are photographing with the sun on one side of you or the other, that you will have half of the image in the shade. The alternative is to take an image with the sun behind you so that everything is receiving an equal amount of light from the sun. So this is a ridgeways rail. And you can see that there's no shadow in the bird other than under the feathers there on the right-hand side. But the whole face and neck and beak, all of that is fully illuminated because the sun was behind me and it turned its head. And so it's all in full light. Other decisions in composing a photograph are your location. So where are you in relation to your subject? Is it safe? Is it ethical? And are you impacting behavior? So safety, obviously, things like you don't want to stop your car in the middle of a busy road. You want to find a safe spot to pull over. You don't want to stand in the road or at the edge of a cliff or anything that might be dangerous to you personally while you're shooting. In terms of ethics, there's ethics not only as it relates to your subject, but to property owners and other things as well. And NAMPA, the North American Nature Photography Association, has a field guide handbook of etiquette and ethics that you can check out. But things like respecting private property and obeying the rules, if you're in, for example, the national parks don't allow drones, so don't use a drone and things like that. So just making sure you're making ethical choices about your subject and the other people who might be impacted by what you're doing. And then impacting behavior, I talked about a lot in the first piece of this. But I can't stress it enough because I think it's really important that you understand behavior and understand and recognize the signs of stress in what you're photographing. It's really critical in wildlife photography, and we don't want birds using up valuable energy to fly away from a perceived threat. And as a photographer, your presence can negatively impact, as I said earlier, hunting or feeding, or the ability of a parent to feed or protect a nest or a chick. So anytime you're photographing nests or dens, that's a super sensitive site, and you need to be extra careful that you're not disturbing it. You don't want to force a bird to move off of young that it needs to be protecting, for example, or fail to feed them and come back to the nest. So no photo, no image is ever worth jeopardizing the health or life of the animal that you're photographing. And this is another barn owl photo because, again, barn owls are quite skittish, and it's just a reminder that they're very vulnerable. They have typically quite short lifespans, and so photographing them requires a lot of care. Other decisions in composing a photograph. So the background and foreground, and this is where we're going to come back to aperture or the f-stop. So a photograph has more impact if the viewer's eye is drawn immediately to the subject of the photo. So you want attention. If you're taking a photograph of a swan, you want everybody's attention, the viewer, to look right at that swan right away when they look at the image. If you have things like bright spots or dark spots in either the background behind it or in front of it in the foreground, that's going to be really distracting to a viewer. Same with like a line running behind the head. So think of like a big branch behind it, or even the horizon line can be distracting, or a tree line. If it chops an animal or a bird in half, it creates just a disconnect, and it distracts from the subject itself. And that's one of those easy fixes. If you're taking a picture and you've got a bird that's stationary, you can look at the back of the camera and see, do you see any bright spots, dark spots, lines, a stick coming out of the back of the owl's head that you could move a little bit to the left, a little bit to the right, up or down, and try and get as clean a backdrop as possible without objects in front of your subject blocking it in the foreground. And that's really, for me, sometimes that's really hard to see through the viewfinder. It's much easier for whatever reason for me to see it when I look at the image on the back of the camera on the screen. So I encourage you to do that. It's also a really good way to test and look at your exposure. I didn't talk about histograms in the first section. If we have time at the end of this, we can talk about setting your camera up so you have a histogram and you can see how your exposure is doing when you take a first test shot and adjust accordingly. So going back to background and foreground, when your aperture is at wide open, the smallest number on your lens is wide open. That will create the shallowest depth of field. And that can create a really pleasing blur in the foreground and the background. But you have to make sure that you have enough of a depth of field to have at least the eye of the bird, and ideally the face, and potentially ideally the whole body, depending on the image you want, in focus. And so depending on the size of the bird, you may need to increase your f-stop from wide open to something else. And as you're doing that, you're increasing the area in the image that's going to be in focus, which will include more of the background and more of the foreground. And I will just touch on quickly, autofocus tends to work best when the lens is wide open as well, just because of how the sensors are situated in the camera. As you start to close your f-stop down, it actually can get to where it's blocking a little bit of the autofocus sensors. And so autofocus doesn't work quite as well, which is part of why I tend to shoot wide open or pretty close to wide open. So this, it was a Cooper's hawk was hunting on a fence post near a trail. You can see that the background is basically entirely creamy in this. That was grass, all dried grass that was glowing a little bit. This was at sunrise. And so by having a really shallow depth of field, you can see that the bird and the post that it's on are in focus, but the background is completely out of focus and the foreground is mostly out of focus. In an ideal world, there are a few pieces of grass in the bottom right corner I would have liked to have be more out of focus. But sometimes you get what you get. And I don't ever, nobody asked this, but I don't generally ever remove things from images. So I tend to, what I shoot is what I get. And so if there's a piece of grass or something else in front of the subject, it usually stays. I very rarely make edits that eliminate those kinds of things from the photo. So anyway, this is an example of a shallow depth of field that gives you a really creamy and non-distracting background for the subject. In contrast to this, so this is a yellow-crowned night heron. They are not normally in Northern California. I was super excited to go see one and photographed it, but you can tell looking at this image that it was in a really super busy bush in this brush with all these sticks. And I did my best to try and darken the background and capture it in a way that your eye goes to the bird because it's the brightest thing in the image. But all those branches are clearly distracting and, not ideal, but so that's just an example of how to see the contrast between something that's really clearly isolated in space and something that's got a lot going on around it. So another decision in composing your photograph is your perspective or point of view and how you want to show your subject in the best possible way. And if you want to convey a sense of the world and that animal or that bird's their experience of the world, if you will, it really helps to be at eye level. And so I mentioned, when that's something on the ground, that it means sitting down the ground or lying on the ground, ideally, so that you're really at eye level. This is a semi-palmated plover, and I was lying down. When I took the picture, you can see there's a little strip of sand, even with the bird's leg, that's in focus. All the rest of the sand in front and behind is out of focus. There is another plover in the image that's not in focus, and that was intentional. If I had wanted to have both birds in focus, I would have had to increase my f-stop significantly because there's a pretty good distance between them. So at least f9 and possibly even 11. So another example, in this image, there are lines moving through the background, but you can see the only branch that's really truly in focus is the one the bird is perched on. And I actually sort of liked in this image that the other branches created a sort of a natural framing. And sometimes this happens where it creates almost a little bit of a box around. This is a yellow-rumped warbler. So again, but I'm eye level with this bird in willows, and just it gives you a sense of place and environment for it. Other decisions in your composition are the focal point. So when you have, so what I've been showing you are stationary birds. When you have birds that are moving or other moving subjects, you always want to make sure that your image has enough space for that subject to move into and out of, like as if it could go out of the frame in that direction. It's also, I mentioned earlier, not always necessary to have close-ups, to have portrait shots, and environmental images can be really, really interesting as well. And in those, typically the wildlife or the bird is a small piece of the overall image, and they can still be very powerful. Settings and exposure is really what we talked about in the first piece of this. Just knowing your settings for various scenarios and knowing how and when to adjust things like your shutter speed or your ISO, and to go from auto ISO into manual ISO. It really helps to get to the point where you know your camera well enough to make those adjustments on the fly, especially when you have birds and wildlife that are fast moving. So it takes a little bit of practice, but even in your backyard or the local park, just getting out there and practicing different shutter speeds, you know, something's, even if it's, you know, ravens and pigeons and scrub jays, going from perched to flying and coming back in and playing with depth of field, you know, with some quail on the ground or something. It really helps to have those things be automatic when you then go out and, you know, make a special excursion to shoot a particular thing. If the camera mechanics are already automatic for you, it's much, much easier to get an image that you're happy with, because you can focus on these creative pieces of it and be less focused on all the dials and the shutter speed and all that. So the first thing I mentioned was having space for a moving subject to go into. So you can see this duck is landing, and there's a diagonal line that runs through the image, which can be a powerful thing. It also has all this space on the right to come land into. So the trajectory of the bird is down into the bottom right corner, and that's where all the blank space is. So you want to have negative space when you have your subject is moving, whether it's flying or running, whatever. If it's moving, you want to have space for it to move into. This is an environmental shot. So this was taken in August of 2020, when we had a lot of wildfires in Northern California. And we had one day where we never saw the sun. The sky was some version of saffron, orange, haze, pretty much the entire day. It was described as apocalyptic. It was really, really bizarre. But this is the Tamales Bay. And so this body of water was reflecting the sky, and it's a flock of brown pelicans flying over the bay. So just an example of an interesting image that's an environmental shot, not just a portrait. Although I admit I do take a lot of portraits, but it's important to have the environment as part of the story if you're working on storytelling. So this slide and some of these next images go to something that Chris mentioned earlier as a question, which is a slow shutter speed. So we'll get into that as one option here. But once you've gotten comfortable with the basics of photography and composition, then you can start doing some things that are more challenging, but can be really fun to play with. So there are interesting ways to use light and show your subject in a different way. So for example, you can use a side light. And if the side light is dramatic, and it can create sort of a shadow effect that's very pleasing. And you can also do backlit images. So you end up with what's called rim lighting, where the outline of what you're shooting is lit up. And that happens when the sun is actually behind your subject. So the order would be the sun, subject, and then you. And basically that works best early and late in the day. So you want the sun low on the horizon. It won't work very well, bright overhead light. Same with side light. I tend to prefer that early or late in the day when it's a little bit of a softer light at a better angle, and not bright light from the middle of the day. Slow shutter speeds are a lot of fun, and they can definitely convey motion and a more artistic look and feel. So one of the things I did when we all got shut down in March of 2020 for COVID, I decided I really wanted to practice panning. So panning is a technique where you reduce your shutter speed quite a lot. So anywhere from 1/20th of a second, 1/50th, 1/60th, 1/80th, usually below 1/100th. And you basically, your focal point goes on the face or the eye of the subject. And as it's moving across space, you're taking your camera and moving with it. And so what happens is, if you do it correctly, and it takes a lot of practice and you get a lot of bad blurry photos, some of them are interesting from a creative standpoint, but you get a lot of photos that you probably will never use. But when you get one that's done correctly, it's really very cool, because the face of what you're photographing will be in focus, and you will have this sense of movement, of blur, of the rest of the image. The background will be sort of like sliding, like almost like you're on a train and it's going by you. It's got that blur. And then if the legs of the bird or the wings of the bird were moving, then that will also be a blur, and it can be really, really beautiful. So it takes a lot of shots to get some good ones, but it's really a lot of fun to do. So I encourage people to practice doing that. If you do decide you want to try and try panning, some of the tutorials, things you can read online, they suggest starting with something really big like cars to practice with. I started practicing with bicyclists on a bike path, and then I moved on to my son on a scooter, and then mammals like bobcats and coyotes. And then last I moved on to small birds, which I'll show you in a minute. One of the slides coming up is a bird panning shot that I did. Another one on the lighting that I forgot to mention, I just skipped over, is silhouettes. So a silhouette is generally going to be a dark subject with a light sky behind it. And rather than doing the intentional overexposure to make the dark subject clear and bring up the shadows so it's visible, you actually do the opposite. You either don't up the exposure adjustment at all, or sometimes you actually drop it down negative, so that you really black out that subject and get just a really crisp outline of what you're photographing without the detail in it. So it's a flip of what you would normally do. Another creative composition piece is focusing on just part of a bird for a close-up or a macro. So I'm going to show some examples of these different things. So for the angle of light, the photo on the left is 2 white-tailed kites. They are backlit at sunset while doing a little bit of a display. And you can see the light going, the bird on the left, the light lighting up the edges of all the feathers. So it's a fun technique. Like I said, it works best early or late in the day. And then the image on the right is a great blue heron at sunrise. This was during one of the rounds of wildfires in the fall. And so the sunrise was particularly orange that day, and it's being reflected in this body of water. And so, and this is where composition and where you position yourself comes into play. So this particular morning, when I got to the body of water and I saw that the sky was reflecting, I set myself up, aimed at this part of the water because I really liked the colors in it, and just waited for a bird to come into it. So I didn't know what, and I didn't know if there would be anything to photograph in it, but I really loved the context. And so was hoping that I would be lucky enough to have something fly in. And as it happens, this great blue heron did come in and then walked the shoreline there for a little bit. So pre-visualizing what you want when you go to a location and deciding what you like about either the light or the backdrop. And then hopefully your subject will cooperate and come into the frame. Now, this is a silhouette. It's a swallow under a dock. And I just, again, it's a totally different look, but you get to where you don't want any detail in this bird's body. You want it to be completely blacked out. And here's the panning shot. So this is a Western snowy plover. And you can see that the eye and the beak are in focus. And then the legs are slightly blurred from motion, and the sand behind it has a little bit of a streakiness to it from the movement. So let's see. And then the other thing from a creative standpoint is the macro or the close-ups. So obviously a mallard, and I just really liked the iridescence and the feathers on the head and the drops of water. And, you know, just taking that one aspect of the bird can be pretty fun. This is another one. This is a raven's chest. And so really see the detail and the texture of the feathers and the coloration, the blues and the purples and the aqua that are part of those raven feathers. I have here some of the other webinars I've done. People can check out, and they're also all on my website. And I'm going to go to the next slide, which says questions, but I think what I'm going to do before I take questions is just also for people who are looking to learn more about composition or about tech specs and just, you know, specifications and gear. There's a ton of great information online. So Creative Live is a website that has a number of top photographers who do online courses that you can watch at whatever pace you want. And like Franz Lanting and Tom Engelson, and you can learn a lot about composition and sort of the artistic side watching those. You can pay by the class, it's not very much, or you can do an annual pass that I think is less than $200, and then you have access to their full library. They have all kinds of classes you can look at, but I particularly like the photography ones. It's something that I did years ago when I was first starting out and really found it valuable. If you shoot Nikon, there's a guy named Steve Perry who has something called Backcountry Gallery, and he does these amazing PDF books about everything you could ever want to know in operating a Nikon camera, in wildlife photography particularly. And so he's got one on bird photography. I think it's, I don't know, it's hundreds of pages long, but it's really, really good. And if you wanted to do a deep dive on some of these tech things, that's a great resource as well. So this last image is a wood duck in a pond that was reflecting the fall foliage up in Oregon. And so the water is a dappled yellow. And again, picking the background that I liked and waiting for the duck to float into it so that I could get that color contrast. And with that, Chris, I will let you start asking me questions.
Okay, so we have opened the chat room, and so it is now open for questions. If you've got some questions, go to the chat room and type them in. Either send them directly to me, Chris, or to Bob, or to everyone, whatever is available. I'm not sure right now. But we will stall for time for a minute while we get a couple of those questions. One of the things, Sarah, that I think is interesting is let me see, what's the number? There were about 175 people in this room today. That's a lot of advanced photographers. That's a lot of people who really like shooting birds. And I really appreciate you coming on and talking all your gibberish numbers and letters to make them happy. I don't know what you were talking about, but I hope a lot of people are really happy about it. And I just want to let everybody know that we have Zoom rooms for 1,000 people. So we could have had another 825 people in here. So please, once you're done here, share with your friends so we can get more people in to enjoy all of this stuff. Okay, so we've got some questions coming here. So Sarah, if you could unshare your program, and then just me and you will be up in front like chums, chit-chatting and talking about numbers and letters and photography stories. Okay, so here we go. Somebody said Scott Perry is awesome. High Gallery is highly recommended. Backcountrygallery.com. And then, okay, so now Sarah, I honestly, I've got 100 million pictures, and now what do I do with these? How do I submit my photos for other people to enjoy? Magazines, newsletters, Flickr, what do I do with all these beautiful, amazing shots?
Wow, that is a great question. And I think it's a question that every aspiring advanced photographer probably reckons with. So there's a lot of different things you can do with your images. Obviously, there's social media, and you can share images on social media. There's websites. So a lot of photographers have websites and sell prints and other things on their website. Some people have Etsy stores where they sell things, t-shirts, tote bags, pillows, whatever, with their photographs on them. But separate from all of that, there are a number of nonprofits. So I got into conservation photography because I wanted to give back to all these species that I was getting something out of the communion I had with them when I went out to take photos. And I wanted to help protect them and to ensure that they had ecosystems to live in that humans sometimes make difficult, really. So I've teamed up with several different nonprofits and allow them to use my images in their materials. So, and I know Don Quintana does the same thing. So things like Project Coyote, Raptors Are the Solution, Wyoming Untrapped. Most areas have some local wildlife rehabilitation center. I've gone in and photographed wildlife for them and allowed them to use some of my images. So there's a volunteer component if you want, or licensing. It is one of the challenges of photography generally, the compensation piece of it. It requires an enormous investment of time and gear, as people have previously noted, to really get quality images. And it is still hard to get paid very much for those images, generally in publications or licensing fees. So that's just an issue. But there's lots of good work you can do. I started doing classroom presentations. In California, the second grade curriculum includes owls. So I do owl presentations in classrooms with my photos and talk to second graders about coexistence and rodenticides and the different owls in our neighborhoods. And it's another great way to inspire kids to love these animals and these birds, and hopefully to be inspired to protect them. And then if you want to get into publishing, it is definitely, it's out there as an option, but it takes a really significant commitment of time and energy to come up with stories and pitch stories. There's a woman, Jamie Heimbuch, who has a group called the Wild Idea Lab. And it's basically a conservation storytellers forum website and networking group. And she has master classes. And she also has something called the Conservation Storytellers Academy, which has classes like Conservation Photography 101, which teaches you how to pitch stories. I took that class actually in February of 2020. Really valuable. If you really want to get published, it's a way to workshop a story and figure out what you need. But it's very difficult to just have like a great photo and send it into a publication and have them run it. Usually you have to have a story, you have to have a series of images, you have to have a pitch. And even then communicating with editors is challenging. They're flooded with pitches. And so being one that gets their attention and gets a response, and then past that even gets published, takes an enormous investment of time and energy. So I think it's totally worthwhile. It's something that I spend a lot of time and energy doing, but it's not easy.
Can you just give us a review of the process for getting your suburban bobcat story in and how that went. Maybe just tell us a little story about, I know bobcats are your love, and you've got some great photos. And how did you get that story in, and where did it end up, and how long did it take? Just help us be a little realistic about that.
Totally. That's something I'd be happy to do. So yes, bobcats are my particular passion project, and suburban bobcats were a project that I spent several years photographing, mother cat and her kittens over a couple of years. And so when I took the Conservation Photography 101 class, part of that class is workshopping a story. And so because I had multiple years of images for these suburban bobcats, I decided that was the story I was going to workshop in this class. And so I wrote the pitch and organized the gallery of images in February of 2020, and then spent 6 months refining the pitch and started pitching it to publications in August of 2020. And in November of 2020, had a commitment from Bay Nature Magazine, which is a regional magazine here in Northern California, that they wanted to publish the piece. And went into, so it's a 6-image photo essay that I wrote the captions for. And it was published in March of 2021 is when it came out. It was the spring issue of 2021. So I think I had the piece written and submitted in like late January of 2021. So basically 2 years of shooting the project, and a year from when I started, more than a year from when I started drafting it as an idea to when it actually got published.
Kind of a personal question, but reality, did you get paid for it? Because I want to know if that's a way I should plan to fund my retirement.
Yes and no. Yes, I did get paid for it. No, it will not fund your retirement.
Okay, I just needed to know if I needed to get a big lens. Someone had another ethical question, and that is using a flash. Do you ever use flash in your photography? Is that a problem like with hummingbirds, or what's your thought on flash?
That's a really great question. And actually, it reminds me there's a different ethical piece that I could touch on as well. I don't ever use a flash. I think I'm pretty far to one end of my desire to minimize disruptions. And so a lot of people, especially people who shoot macro, use filler flashes and other things to try and impact the light in the image. I don't. You run the risk, depending on what you're shooting, you run the risk of blinding the subject if it's a very bright flash aimed directly at it, or if it's, flashes at night are not a good idea for those animals because it's going to impact their vision. So some photographers use flashes, I don't. Same goes for calls. So bird calls are something that I know birders use at times, and Audubon has a field guide, recommendation for when and how to use calls. As a photographer, I don't use calls. I don't think it's, for me personally, appropriate to use calls, because I would simply be summoning a bird to basically perform for me, to show up so I could take its picture, and that requires it to expend energy, to potentially leave a nest, leave its territory, thinking it's finding a mate or an invader. There's not a lot of study on it, but there's at least one study that suggests that it impacted the status of the males in a particular territory when a call was played in its territory. And I'm just not personally comfortable doing that. So I photograph whatever birds are there and don't call them. A little bit, some people differ on that. Other people use calls. And I think, you have to be very, very careful if you're going to use them in photography, how and when and where. They're not allowed in the National Seashore here in Point Reyes, for example. You can't call birds in for photography. And if you're in a place where there's a lot of people using calls, or if you're doing it repetitively, like, all of that has cumulative negative impacts. So you really have to be careful. more clear cut is baiting, and baiting birds, particularly baiting owls with mice, is definitely not a good idea. It's detrimental to the owls, and it's a practice that hopefully will eventually go away. But there are photography workshops that people run that include owls that are being baited. So it's a good idea if you're thinking about going on an owl workshop or other wildlife photography workshop to get a sense from the people running the program, whether baits or calls are going to be used, so that you can make an informed decision about whether you want to participate.
Okay, thank you. That's very good. We have a few more questions, and we've got about 5 or 6 more minutes. So
Okay.
let's see how many of these we can get. One was just a basic hardware question of, where do you store all your images? You've got thousands of images. Are they on a hard drive, or do you use the cloud, or where are your images at?
So I have a couple different things. I do use external hard drives for the images. So Lacey has 4 and 5 terabyte drives that are rugged drives. And so every time I import my photos, I always make 2 copies of everything in case something happens to one copy. So every time I import my cards, I'm importing to 2 Lacey drives with the images.
Okay. Megan wants to know about competitions and entering competitions. Have you done much competition entering with your photos?
I have. So NAMPA, the North American Nature Photography Association, has a showcase every year. Last year, I had an image placed in the top 250. This most recent past year, I had an image placed in the top 100 there. I have entered other contests. One of the things about contests that is a little tricky is that you do, depending on the contest, you give away your intellectual property rights to the image by entering it. And so you have to read the fine print really carefully. Some contests are really narrow. They say, if you entered into this contest, you allow us to use it to promote the contest in the future. And obviously, if you win, they get to, have a gallery or an exhibition or print a book or whatever they're going to do with the winning images. And that's probably fine. That's kind of the minimum. But some contests, you actually are giving them the rights to your image for any use, and including sub-licensing it. So they can then give it to somebody else, to a third party to use. And so I tend to enter relatively few contests. It's a way potentially to get recognition. For me, the photography is really all about conservation work. And so if I think something advances the conservation story, so for example, the NAMPA top 100 photo that I had this last year, I was excited because it was an image in Point Reyes of a Tule elk with a group of cattle facing it off. And out here in this park right now, there is an ongoing debate about the use of the park and the presence of ranching in the park. So there's a conservation story behind that image. And so, but that's for me personally, that's sort of the fine print and the importance to me of the story are usually how I decide whether to enter or not.
Right. I think you brought up a couple of important points about licensing and use of licenses. Can you comment on copywriting photos?
So copywriting, like with the federal, the actual copyright registry?
I don't know. Sometimes I see photos with a little signature at the bottom line that says copyright by Sarah.
Oh yeah.
Copywriting
Yes.
your photo, or what do you call it when you put the letters on top of a photo? I forget.
So it is called, and I'm going to show mine. It is called a watermark. So if you look at this wood duck in the bottom right corner, it's my watermark. That's the copyright symbol and my name. So that is, if you are exporting an image from Lightroom, which is how I do it, when you export, there's a whole menu of things, and one of them is a drop-down menu for watermarks, and you can create and add a watermark when you export it. So then when you have a JPEG file that you want to use for social media, you can put it on as you export it. It's being put on automatically. You can also set up your camera to record the copyright and your name on every image in the data, basically in the image. So usually on my images, the title of every image is my first name, last name, and then a file number. I have a watermark on the image, and then the original data from the camera also always has my copyright in it.
I guess that's important. So if you saw one of your photos of a bobcat as a giant billboard over Marin, you'd say, do I want to go after that or not? Because you'd have to follow those copyright things or something, right?
Yeah, and so there is a copyright registry. I have done that federal process. I don't always do, I haven't done it for all my images. I have done it for a lot of them, especially the ones on my website I have. But it is good to have a watermark even for social media. So I've had images lifted from Instagram and used by other people, not crediting, not the sort of resharing so-and-so's with my, Instagram at SK Wildlife Photos, but somebody else just posting it as if it was their image. And when I contact Instagram and say, I need you to take this down, this is my intellectual property being posted by this person, it really helps to have the original posting with my watermark on it. And usually when people are doing that, it's hard. I try and make it so that it's hard to cut the watermark out and not impact the image. So usually at least part of my name is still in the image that they've used. So yeah, it's a good thing. And then yes, if somebody uses it, you can also, you can send a cease and desist letter, or you can send them a request for a licensing fee after the fact. And I've done that too. I've had people run my photo and then send them a letter and say, you didn't have a licensing agreement. I'd like you to pay a licensing fee for the use.
Wow. Well, this was very, very educational, Sarah. I don't know how we can thank you. This was supposed to be a master class for what, 15 or 20 people. And instead you made a provision so 175 people can learn from you, and we really appreciate that. So thanks very much. We're going to say goodbye to you as we put up our closing slide. And this closing slide, again, is an opportunity to make donations. And it also is announcing our next program.